This is a reading from the fourth chapter of John. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" For Jews use nothing in common with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." I was very sad yesterday to have a work commitment that kept me from attending the memorial service for Harriet Clark. Harriet was involved with me in an adventure that still has great and lasting meaning for me. I think it happened probably sometime around 2002. I was still pretty new to the yearly meeting. Uh, the first yearly meeting that I was in, Wilmington yearly meeting, I had just been hired by Cincinnati Friends. I didn't go to it. The second one, I think maybe I went to, but I'm just not sure. But this was early on. This happened around 2002. And perhaps the yearly meeting was in Tennessee that year, or perhaps it wasn't. But at the time, I lived in or near Billingsville, Indiana. And it took about 2 or 2.5 hours to get to Wilmington because there really was not any direct route. And I still remember having to drive through the town of Red Lion, which has this incredible five-way intersection, which no matter how many times I drive through, I never quite get used to. Anyway, I had a small place in Billingsville. It was about 3 acres, but directly adjacent to it, you would have thought that it was my driveway, but it wasn't my driveway. My neighbors, Lum and Miriam, had a Quonset hut and a pole barn, and they parked an RV inside of the Quonset hut, and they came over from Columbus and lived in the RV 2 or 3 days a week. And their reason was for coming was because this was kind of Lum's ancestral territory, and Lum and Miriam maintained bluebird and purple martin colonies throughout Union County, and therefore, right next to my yard, in fact, if you didn't know any better, you would think it was my yard, there were purple martins flying overhead constantly during the purple martin season. I mean, literally hundreds of them. I had never really been exposed to purple martins before, and I loved them. I loved the way they sounded. I loved to watch them fly. Uh, they're so musical. I mean, it almost sounds like listening to a tiny waterfall. But Lum had told me that they would be leaving at the end of July, and I knew I was going to miss them, and I knew that they would leave while I was at yearly meeting. So I had seen them gathering all together as a flock and making huge sweeping flights through the air, which is what they do for a couple of weeks in preparation for their great migration back to South America. Um, and so I knew the time was getting close, and I was really worried that I wouldn't be able to hear them anymore. So, and you can tell how long ago this was. I had a tape recorder, a good tape recorder, and I put it at the base of their colony. And I started to record them as I packed to go to yearly meeting. I just left it there and I puttered around. I watered the flower beds. I packed my things. I put everything in the car. Uh, it must have been Tennessee because I put a map in the car. I put in my cup of coffee, all that stuff. And I went across the yard to pick up my tape recorder and throw it in the car and then go off to yearly meeting and listen to the tape whenever. But when I went to pick up the tape recorder, I discovered a little purple martin lying on its back about 2 feet from the tape recorder. At first, I thought that it was dead, but then I saw its chest rise and fall with breath. And I picked it up and I was able to see that there was a problem with one wing, but that it seemed really pretty healthy otherwise. And I don't know anything about repairing or caring for birds, but I couldn't stand the idea of this little bird just dying there at the base of the pole while I went off to yearly meeting. And eventually it occurred to me that because Harriet Clark worked at the Nature Center, perhaps I could call Harriet and she would know somebody who would be able to help the little bird. And at first, I thought, she's going to think I'm really silly. And I hesitated to call her, but then I remembered a newspaper clipping that someone had brought in and posted on the bulletin board at Cincinnati Friends. And it was about some firefighters somewhere in Cincinnati and a large moth which had flown into the firehouse and laid eggs on the fire equipment, and how the firefighters had saved the eggs and donated them to the Nature Center. And Harriet was featured in this article. And I thought to myself, this is a woman who takes in moth eggs. Surely she will be able to think of someone who can do something for this injured purple martin. So I called up Harriet at the Nature Center. And after some discussion of the options available and not available, she offered to be the surrogate shepherd for the purple martin if I could bring it by the Nature Center, which it wasn't going to be hard for me to do, to drive there, but I didn't know how to make the bird comfortable in the car. She said quite decisively to put it in a paper bag along with a paper towel for it to grip with its feet. She said, fold over the top of the paper bag so that it will be dark, and that will keep the bird calmer. And then she said that the journey would still be very traumatic for the bird, just being enclosed in the paper bag, driving in a car. And we couldn't really be sure that the bird would survive the trip. So I found a paper bag and I put a paper towel inside of it and I placed the bird in the bag. And the little bird, which I was just calling he, I don't know what sex it actually was, but he seemed to be okay. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't trying to flap his wings, but I was still worried about him. And I wondered whether there was anything else I could do to help keep the bird calm. And it occurred to me that since he was in a bag anyway, if I played him the tape that I had just made of his home and family, the tape of the purple martin colony, maybe it would calm him down a little. And if he started fluttering around and beating against the bag, I would know that the tape was not helping and I'd turn it off. But if he kept quiet, what would it hurt? So I put the paper bag in the front seat. I stuck the tape of the martin colony in the car stereo and off we drove. I can't say for sure, but the tape seemed to help. The bag was mostly quiet with only an occasional chirp. The tape played for about 45 minutes and then I rewound it and started it over. When we got close to the Nature Center, the road became quite curvy and there were some very annoyed chirping sounds coming from the bag. But by that time he had been mostly so quiet, I was just glad to know that he had not died. So we got to the Nature Center. I peered inside the bag to find the little bird looking back at me, still looking healthy and alert and with one injured wing. I took my bag inside, I found Harriet, and I turned over the little purple martin. 5 days later, Harriet called me wanting to know when I could come retrieve the bird and take him back to the purple martin colony. She said that he was in a cage on her desk, his wing was healthy, and he was eating down her entire supply of mealworms. He would chirp and sing to her, but he also kept flying against the sides of the cage, and she was concerned that he was going to damage his wings again just by beating against the sides of the cage. So the next day, she brought the purple martin in the cage over to the Cincinnati Friends Meeting House. I came back after an afternoon appointment, and the martin was chirping away in the library, and Harriet was kind of cooing at him. We brought him outside into my car, and as I put the cage in the front seat beside me, Harriet was giving me instructions to make sure that there were other martins around when I released him. And I was hoping that there would be. But most of the martin colony had, in fact, left while I was at yearly meeting. I knew that there were at least 3 or 4 left because I had seen them flying either 1 or 2 at a time, but I didn't know how long they would be there. And so I was worried sitting there next to the little purple martin about what we would find when we got home. Were there going to be any purple martins there at all? But there he was, sitting next to me, fluttering a little bit against the cage, chirping vigorously. I thought to myself, why not try the tape again? So I started up the car and put the tape in the tape player, and when the first sound started, the martin cocked his head and looked around. He was attentive and listening, but he was quiet and he wasn't fluttering, except there was one place on the tape where he joined in with the chirping and singing. It lasted about a minute or so, and then he was quiet again. The tape ended, I rewound it and started it over. We came to that same place on the tape, and he started again to chirp and cry for about a minute and a half until that place was over, and then he got quiet again, and we pulled into my driveway. So not knowing whether there were what I was going to find, I got out of the car and I took out the cage and I walked into the backyard, and there wasn't a purple martin in sight. It was the time of evening when I had often seen them in flight, feeding on aerial insects, but there wasn't a bird to be seen. I sat down on the back steps in some despair, because if they had all flown off, I didn't know what would happen to this little bird. He wouldn't know where or how to migrate on his own, and Harriet thought he had not yet learned how to catch his own meals on the fly. He needed to be with other birds. So I sat there, and I thought once again about the tape. I thought about the section that the little martin always chirped at. I wondered whether, if there were any other martins around, I could attract some of those martins. So I went into the house and I got a boombox and carried it out to the yard and put the tape in the player and rewound the tape a little bit to make sure I had the right section, and pressed play and turned up the volume. For a while, nothing happened. I had nearly given up when I noticed 2 martins flying directly above the boombox. One of them eyed it and flew away. The other one landed on a perch at the colony just a few yards away. It sat there looking at us. I fed the little martin a few last-minute mealworms, brought it out of the cage and released it from my hands. It flew in a large circle. It didn't seem actually to know how to stop flying. After 4 or 5 circles, the martin that was perching in the colony joined it. It flew behind it for a while, and then it began to fly in front of it, and finally they flew off to where I could see them no longer. The next morning, I noticed that there were maybe half a dozen to a dozen birds that had come back to the colony for a little bit. Several of them were smaller ones, the size of the martin that I had released. I really think that one of those little birds was the purple martin that I had rescued, and that it had found its people, its birds, and that when this last group gathered together, they flew to South America together. The reason I remember that story is because for me it goes along with something that the singer-songwriter David Wilcox sings about and talks about as a story when he sings this song. And what he says is, God knows your native tongue. God knows how to reach you. God knows the language of your heart. There's a way in which this story of the purple martin reminds me of the story of the woman at the well. I'm going to continue the story that I had started. Jesus asks the Samaritan woman for a drink. She said, "What? Why are you asking me for a drink? You're a Jew. I'm Samaritan. Uh, we don't have anything to do with each other." He says, "If you knew who I was, you would have asked me for living water, and you would never be thirsty." And to continue, she says to him, "Sir, you do not even have a bucket, and the cistern is deep. Where are you going to get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the cistern and drank from it himself with his children and his flocks?" Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I shall give will never thirst. The water I shall give will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to Jesus, "Sir, give me this water so that I may not be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come back." The woman answered and said to him, "I do not have a husband." Jesus answered her and said, "You are right in saying I do not have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." And they banter back and forth a little bit. And she says that she knows that the Messiah is coming, and Jesus tells her that he is the Messiah. And then the gospel goes on. At that moment, his disciples returned and were amazed that he was talking with this woman. They're a little bit scandalized because they make assumptions about the kind of woman she is. They think to themselves, "Why are you talking with her?" But because she was responding to Jesus, the woman left her water jar and went into the town and said to the people, "Come see a man who told me everything I have ever done. He knew me inside and out." Do you think he could be the Messiah? The people came out from the town to see him. There's an awful lot of information packed into this gospel story. But what especially grabs me about this story is the idea that Jesus knew this woman, that he knew her life and what was in her heart. And he knew how to speak to her in a way that reached her. I mean, somehow he told her that she had lived a scandalous life. She was living with someone who wasn't her husband. She'd already had 5 husbands or 4 or however many. He told her that she had lived a scandalous life and she felt known and cared about. He spoke to her about living water, and living water was what she wanted. He might have used, he could have used, he would have used different words with someone else. He would have used different words with me or with you. Because God knows our native tongue. If we were Purple Martins, God would speak to us in Purple Martin language. And that is always going on, not just sometimes. We don't necessarily listen all the time, but God is always speaking. And so I wonder, for each one of us, what God has been saying in your native tongue lately. And it could be that it isn't words. It could be something that happened, an event, a dream, somebody's kindness to you. What is it that God is saying in your native tongue to you these days?